Hello, I'm Susan Lohafer, the author of this book, The Reluctant Patriot, a novel based on a true story of the Civil War in Tennessee. Most of us have a time and place we would like to visit, regardless of when we live, and for me it was always the mid-1800s. I probably wouldn't have liked the plumbing or the corsets, but if I were going to imagine myself into the mind of someone I'd like to have known, it would probably be someone like Emily Dickinson or Abraham Lincoln. So, when I came to write an historical novel, I turned to the 19th century. All I needed was a story. I'd recently moved to Tennessee, and one day, as I was browsing through some books on the Civil War, I found what I was looking for, but I just didn't know it at first. The last person I would have imagined caring about or being interested in was an obscure, hard-headed, middle-aged farmer from Greenville, Tennessee, with the awkward name of Harrison Self, S-E-L-F. His world was no larger than the county he lived in. He had no political or ideological stake in the war. He thought it was just a quarrel among politicians, people who didn't know anything about what was important in farming, and he was a local man. Whole range of his experience was limited to his world. But before the war was over, he would find himself branded a traitor and a terrorist, imprisoned with a future governor of the state, put on trial by a military court with a predetermined verdict, and sentenced to death. I guess you could say that Harry grew on me. I watched him evolve from a farmer defined by his land and his family into a citizen defined by a wider sense of heritage and his duty to other citizens, both white and black, and by a new understanding of the relationship between country and self. In time, I came to think of Harry as I found him central to my own understanding of America, as important in his way as Emily or Abe. I'm sometimes asked about the most famous character in the book, William Ganaway Brownlow. He began life as a very famous figure in Tennessee history. He began life as an itinerant circuit-riding Methodist minister, getting to know, by that means, many people of in all walks of life in many counties around the area. And he honed his debating skills, no doubt, through his arguments with or on ecclesiastical points with ministers in other denominations. He became well known as the owner and editor of the Knoxville Whig, a very famous newspaper at the time. It was the longest surviving Union sympathizing newspaper in the South. Harry first knew of Brownlow, became aware of him as the fire-breathing editor of that newspaper, someone who perhaps inspired the very impractical and dangerous passions of the young. So Harry's first impression of Brownlow was quite negative. At a later time, however, he found himself in the same prison with Brownlow, and Brownlow was able to play an important role in Harry's life at that time. Later, Brownlow would become the first governor of the state after the war, and later still he would become a senator. As governor, he instituted a state guard, which his enemies regarded as just a personal enforcer group, a kind of private police force doing his bidding. However, the state guard secured the election sites on the early elections after emancipation, and it was in this regard that the state guard, and this part of the story is fictional, gave Harry an opportunity to develop further as a person, to achieve a kind of personal reformation. Before I start reading, here's a look at 1861. On June 8th, Tennessee voted to secede from the Union. However, the eastern counties, the mountainous counties, voted 2-1 against secession. They wanted to remain in the Union. This part of the state had small independent farms in the valleys. It had independent, free-living hunters in the mountains. And many of the citizens were descended from the revolutionary heroes who, in many ways, helped to shape the attitudes of the region. They had fought and won at great cost a nation, and there were deep loyalties to that nation in this area. It helps to explain the strong unionist feeling and fervor in this part of a state that, as a whole, voted to join the Confederacy. Samuel P. Carter, a very prominent citizen of the area, hatched a plan, and he took it to Washington, and it was approved by Lincoln in person. The plan was quite ambitious. They were going to gather together citizens in various parts of the state and form guerrilla bands and attack 9 railroad bridges on the same night, November 8th, 1861. The plan, of course, the point was to disrupt the Confederate supply lines. These railroad networks were the link between the Cotton States and Virginia, seat of the Confederacy. So they were very important. And if they could be disrupted, that would be a significant blow to the Confederacy and the Confederate Army. So that was the hope. Harry lived near one of the bridges targeted for the sabotage, Lick Creek Bridge, but he had no interest in this plan. He thought it was foolish, suicidal. Harry was the sort of man who really couldn't imagine vandalizing someone else's property. And he thought it was simply a wrong-headed and dangerous enterprise. His son, however, his teenage son, Hugh, he thought it was a glorious idea, and possibly inspired by some of those flamboyant editorials by Brownlow, Hugh decided to join the local band of guerrillas. Their rendezvous point was his uncle's home, not that far away, Harry's brother-in-law, Jacob Harmon. So on the night of November 8th, Hugh sneaked away to join the men who were going to sabotage the bridge. Harry, when he realized this, was angry, frightened, and set out after his son to bring him back to sanity, and to bring him back to his mother. And that's where the story begins. Greenville, Tennessee, November 8th, 1861. As he stepped carefully among the saddled horses, Harry could hear them moving their hobbled weight in the gloom. Their warm breath clouded the November chill. Here and there he stroked a muscled neck, lifting the nap of coarse hair. In the dark he was wary of their stamping hooves. "Pay me no mind," he whispered. Time was short, and yet he slowed in their midst, feeling their inner heat, their careless strength, their indifference to the road they traveled. They were as tolerant of him as if he'd once had 4 legs. Peering up into the heavens, he lost his gaze in the liquid dark, hoping to catch God's eye. All he saw was the paleness above the tree line. All he knew was what he'd learned in half a century. Must be about 9, he judged, as if he'd heard nature's clock chime. Then the pain flooded back, gushing through his veins and pooling in his stomach. How much simpler it would be if his toes were mashed to pulp. His heart on a spit wouldn't satisfy Cornelia if he failed to bring their son back. Harry crossed the patch of swept earth and mounted the single stair. He leaned into the solid wood he'd helped Jake saw and plane and settle into place on hinges strong enough to stop a bull. The planks gave an inch, then resisted, heaving with the crowd on the other side. Harrison's self firmed his jaw. This was his brother-in-law's house, where on any other day he could enter without knocking. From his own front door, it was only a mile's walk, though tonight he forced Castor to a gallop that surprised them both. Nor had he expected what followed. To be standing on this doorstep, fighting to gain a toehold, was like milking a wooden cow. If you had sense, you lost interest. But he couldn't give up. They had his son in there, he was sure of it, and there was no going home without Hugh. When an opening appeared, he lodged his foot in the crack. They would not keep him out. No, they would not. Though earlier in the day he'd refused to be one of them, said it was none of his affair. Only a fool lights a match in his own barn, he'd said, thinking he had clinched the argument. Yet his son had trailed after them, so here was Harry, come to pull the child back, lest he burn himself. No one's fault then but Hugh's that his father looked ridiculous as he fought with the stubborn door, though no one saw him but the waiting horses. It was a sizable herd, and he reckoned most of the able-bodied men of Greenville must be visiting the Harmons. One thing he knew, their dirty boots would be breaking his sister's heart, fouling the boards she scrubbed every day in case the deity dropped by. Sometimes he smiled at her housewifely care, but tonight he shared her outrage. They'd be making a mess in there, words pouring out regardless of consequences. He'd have kept his distance, but here he was, pounding on the door. How his fingers itched for Hugh's collar. Let him but get a hand on the boy. First he'd hold the truant close. A foretaste of the moment pierced him. Then he'd grab Hugh by the belt, hoist him in a circled arm, and haul him back to sanity. Once again he aimed his right shoulder, muscled from a lifetime behind the plow, at the door to Jake's house. It gave way, throwing him off balance, but he sidled through the opening. Bare heads fenced him in. That's all he could see, pressed as he was behind a wall of broad backs. What reached him were the smells. Damp wool that stank of sheep, the bitter tang of tobacco, the sour flatulence of churning guts. Harry craned his neck to reconnoiter. These were his neighbors and fellow townsmen, and they'd come in from the fields or ridden over from the village, carrying with them the sweat of their day's work, their chins darkening with stubble. Melinda's house had been breached. Friend or foe, she wouldn't care. She'd want them gone. She had a feud with hobnail boots, his own included, and he vowed to honor it someday. The crowd was shifting, and Harry rose on tiptoe. In a pool of light cast by a single candle, the men were forming a rough circle around the Harmon family dinner table. When he could see them, the faces were known to him. Hawn was there, looking dazed, and Matt and Henry, their mouths gaping holes. And wasn't that Seth Gordon over there, the schoolteacher who taught boys how to argue with their fathers? In the flickering light, they were creatures in a dream, with noses too long or eyes gone to slits, no longer themselves. But who else could they be? He'd known them all his life. Driven though he was to find his son, Harry felt his head turn without having willed it. That, then, must be Captain Fry, the tall black silhouette with broad shoulders, right arm raised toward the ceiling, and, as Harry glimpsed through a sudden gap, left hand clutching to his chest the starry end of a giant flag. Rusted red, dirty white, the dim stripes flowed over the table's edge. Men were swarming in now, eager to grab their handful of cloth, their fistful of patriotism. But where was Hugh? Harry searched for the broad forehead under a fringe of brown hair. The boy's eyes would be round as cartwheels. Shorter than his elders, he'd be somewhere in the rear, jumping up and down to get a look. Even the half-grown boys, and Harry had noticed many, could see Fry's arm reaching higher now. The shouting died down, like the hush before a storm. Harry felt the silence on his skin like a passing shadow. In its wake came the ragged breaths and shifting feet of men used to hearing speeches. Fry's voice, when it came, was low but clear. He'd been appointed, he said, by our own Reverend Carter, whose idea this was, who had been up to Camp Dickey in Kentucky, and had the word from Sherman and McClellan, and yes, old Abe himself. Eyes met eyes, and grins flashed at the name. Inwardly, Harry groaned. Against the allure of adventure he might prevail, and yes, perhaps even against the glamour of a real-life Union soldier, like that black-bearded rabble-rouser up there. But against the image of Father Abraham, what hope for a mere parent? The rumors were true, assured Fry. Up and down the valleys on this very night, men, good men, men just like them, were meeting in secret, preparing for the mission. Here in Greenville, it was he himself. You know me, boys, he reminded them, who had been chosen to bring the word. If they were willing, are you willing, boys? He would lead them over to Lick Creek Bridge, and by God, they'd make a bonfire those Rebs would see all the way to Knoxville. No, by God, all the way to Nashville. They'd raise a shout that would be heard by the Federal Army that's just waiting, boys, for our signal. General Thomas is hunkered down up there, just over the border. He'll finish what we start, boys, but we have to light the match. Every word had dropped to the pit of Harry's stomach. Had he been close enough to be seen and heard, he'd have raised a hand and bent each finger in turn. 1. The bridge is guarded by men whose faces ye know, men whose children ye know. 2. How long will it take for the bridge to be rebuilt? 3. An army in Kentucky is an army beyond the mountains. 4. Winter is coming. 5. What if the generals change their minds and leave you hanging by your necks? But he did not shout above the noise. He did not fight his way into the lighted circle. He didn't even try. Reason had no purchase in this room. He'd not moved, but no, he really thought, not because his neighbors would think him cowardly. The why of it was simply this: he was not his brother's keeper, or, in this case, his brother-in-law's. Nor was he responsible for his neighbors. They were free men, just like him. They'd have to live with their decisions, or, he trembled to think of it, die for them. No, he was here to retrieve his 16-year-old son. That was all. Still, he had not seen the boy. Fry was in full voice. He was explaining the plan devised by their own Reverend Carter. At the same time as the men in this room marched on Lick Creek, others, up and down the line, would attack other bridges along the rivers and streams of East Tennessee, from Bristol to Chattanooga. 9 of them. With the railroad crippled and the telephone wires cut, well, we'll just see how Jeff Davis can manage without those cottonheads from the South and those supplies that come by rail. We'll show 'em whose land this is, won't we, boys? The deafening response made the walls shake. Harry, picturing his small but tidy farm, whispered to himself, "I know whose land it is. Not Davis's. No. But not Thomas's either. Not even Uncle Abe's. Mine." Fry then cried out, "Wait!" It was a moment before he could be heard again. He said there was more required of them than just a brave spirit, though he was glad to see that he hadn't been wrong. He'd said to the generals, "You can rely on the men I grew up with," because, yes, he'd been whelped under Bay's Mountain like the rest of them. Cheers again. Harry was sure he'd heard that claim from every circuit-riding office-seeker who'd ever canvassed in Greenville. "Men," said Fry more solemnly. The boys had aged quickly. Harry would have smiled had not the hairs on his body pricked up. "Understand what this means. This is an act of war against the Confederacy, and you may be taken or questioned afterwards." The silence that followed was like the ring in the air after iron has been struck. "And so," Fry went on, his words as clear and strong as hammer blows, "ye are, for this one night, no longer citizens of Greenville, but soldiers in the Federal Army. Take a hold of the flag, men, those who are close enough. Inasmuch as the rest of ye are here, ye are holding a piece of it too. Say it now. I swear to..." And so the oath was administered. In the blink of an eye, Jake's 60-odd neighbors, most of whom had never, to Harry's knowledge, touched another man's property, were transformed into Company F, 2nd Tennessee Volunteer Infantry, sworn to march on a local bridge and tear it limb from limb. For just a second, it was like a tableau, a restaging of a scene from history, the sort of parlor entertainment designed by bookish women. Then the heroes came to life, bumping into each other's sides and stepping on neighbors' toes. While the oath was being taken, Harry's lips did not move, but his eyes darted everywhere. From a rope among the rafters hung a few white shirts. Melinda must have washed and left to dry. Ghostly, yet intimate, they stretched down their arms. He wondered if his sister remembered that her laundry was on view. He was too distracted to form a thought, but for a fleeting second he felt the light, alien, admonishing touch of the female world so roughly displaced this night. But no one else was looking upward, and he lost the brief sensation. Once again he scanned from head to head, face to face, looking for the shape that would fill him with relief, catching his breath at a half-seen possibility, all but moaning as some other child, some other father's son, gazed back at him. Fry was still speaking, telling the men to get going now. to string themselves out so as not to announce their coming, and to tie their horses a quarter-mile from the bridge by the old oak split by lightning, and to wait for him there. The crowd began to shift, to stir, funneling toward the door through which Harry had forced his entrance. As the men scraped through, over the threshold, as Harry dismissed every bearded jaw, every brawny arm, his heart sank and then soared. Was it possible Hugh hadn't disobeyed him? What if, ordered to stay at home, the boy had wandered off to sulk and was already back in bed? If that were true, if Harry had spent the last hour making a fool of himself, while all the while he worked his fist spasmodically. The last one out of the house was Hawn, pausing on the step to raise a slender hand to his chin, stroking it absently. From that gesture alone, Harry would have known him. "Alex," Harry bent close, touching his friend's arm with a finger. "Did she happen to notice? Was Hugh inside? Did you see him?" "Hugh?" Hawn's eyes focused on him, turning urgent as if he had a question of his own to ask. Then he said, "Oh, Hugh. Yes, I think I saw him, and Jake's two boys, Tom and Henry. But I didn't see him come out." Harry seized another hope. "Could he have stayed inside, do you think?" "Let's look. Maybe he—" Hawn, as if glad of the errand, turned around and re-entered the house. Harry followed. Apparently deserted now, with only the guttering candle for light, the room felt cavernous, but signs of the recent meeting were everywhere. Chairs were overturned, and the flag, in a mockery of its solemn role of just a few minutes ago, had folded itself into a heap on the floor. Now the most human thing in the room was the laundry. In the breeze from the open door, the pale linen shirts swayed like shrouds. A sound made Harry's heart leap, but it wasn't Hugh. The tall, angular figure of his sister gathered solidity, detaching itself from a curtained alcove. Despite his own need, he was stilled by her remoteness. Then he stepped toward her, warily, as if she might fly into a fury or shatter into pieces the moment she saw him. "Melinda?" Getting no answer, he tilted his head and moved into her line of sight. "Melinda, you have to tell me, was our Hugh here? Did you see him?" She turned a face to him that gradually fell into grieving disbelief. "They're gone. Jake took the children. I was not asked." "The children?" "Tom and Henry," she listed her sons, "and Hugh and Sarah's boy, too, the one that lost a finger last year. Will God take the young ones? He will not, will he, Harry?" Her eyes burned and she nodded emphatically. "He will take that captain, the one that started it all, making a mess on my table." "I'll send Kornaya to help you." He waved at the disarray. "Tomorrow. She'll come tomorrow. They'll all be home by then." He laid the flat of his palm on her shoulder, patting twice. Then he hurried away, barely noticing that Hawn trailed behind him, almost stepping on his heels, as if afraid to lose him in the dark. And now just a little bit from the next chapter, the Lick Creek Bridge. Harry has now arrived at the bridge where Captain Fry's men have gathered to burn it down. In the torchlight, he, Harry, could see what they meant to destroy. Beams crisscrossed each other in two rows to support the narrow bridge. Down its center, like an endless spine, ran the tracks of the East Tennessee and Virginia Railroad. The logs that rimmed the outer edge seemed to move and dissolve, and yet were still there, with a row of cloudy snakes curling up and around them. A cheer split the air when the kindling on the ties began to glow. Having no luck with the stanchions underneath, men were poking their torches into the lattice above. Then with a whoosh came a spray of crackling noises, like many branches snapping under snow. Then it was more like a peppering of grape shot. The braces were swallowed by a billowing orange cloud that opened like a wound. At its center burned a flame of molten gold. Even Harry, who hated vandalism of any kind, stopped, turned, and could not look away. Eager as he was to find his son, he was fused to the spectacle, tingling with the enchanted terror of all creatures at the sight of fire. Everywhere the blaze was turning wood to quilted charcoal. Heat slapped him again and again across the face, whipping him like a flag. A dry leaf twirled lazily toward the ground, then another, if one of those cinders, dancing like a firefly. Then he saw him. Hugh was standing still, brushed and bumped by the men around him, as if he were a sapling in the way. Paralyzed by relief, Harry stared. No one, thank God, had given the boy a torch. He'd have dropped it on the leaves, and instead the boy stood rooted to the spot, his face in a trance, painted orange by the light. A cry punched the sky, forcing Harry's head around. One of the trestles had splintered, and now the ties swung down with a series of groans. Slowly, like a skeleton lying down, the bridge collapsed. Glancing at his son again, Harry watched as the glazed look fell apart, the eyes widened, the mouth gaped in wonder. Or was it savagery? Some of the men waved pieces of charred wood as if they were tomahawks. With a twinge of shame, Harry hung back a moment, not knowing if it was Hugh or himself he shrank from confronting. And then, as suddenly as the boy had appeared, he was gone. Groaning with frustration, Harry forced his way toward the now vacant space and swung his eyes in every direction. The boy had gone up in smoke. Cursing himself, Harry bent over, hands on knees. When he slowly straightened up, he noticed a shift in the crowd's attention. The bridge had been decommissioned, but the show wasn't over. Fry had rousted the guards from the tent, and they stood in front of the canvas, bound hand to hand and to each other by hempen cords. Their faces were greasy in the firelight. Some were masked with soot. Of course, no one had thought to bring hoods for them. Fry stood with his hip akimbo and put the choice to them reasonably. They could swear on their honor as free men, never to bear arms against the Union and never to reveal the identity of anyone they recognized. Or they could die. The decision was unanimous. They gave their parole. Already some of the audience was turning away, thinking of anxious wives, early morning chores, or maybe a trip north. The countryside would be swarming with rebel soldiers as soon as the news reached Knoxville. Daylight would bring sobriety and second thoughts. Harry guessed that many of the younger men, and even some of those with families, would hide in the mountains or run off to join the Federals in Kentucky. What if they had been recognized? What if the guards talked after all? The crowd was thinning around him, saddle leather was creaking, and Harry was beginning to think he had only imagined the boy's image in the firelight when he looked straight into Hugh's panicked eyes. Exhaling with relief, he jerked forward, wanting nothing but to whisk the child out of sight. He put out a hand and heard, loudly and clearly, behind him, in another man's voice, "Hugh! Hugh's self! Is that you?" And so begins the end of Hugh's story, and the beginning of Harry's war. Thank you for listening.